Hey folks, welcome back to Only the Best Fantasy Novels. My name is Robin, and today I want to talk about a book that the more time passes between when I've read it to the present, the more it's cementing itself as potentially one of my favorite reads of 2024. And that is The Seven Moons of Maali Almeida by Shehan Karunatikala. So, this is a literary fantasy novel that actually won the Booker Prize in 2022, which is how it got pitched to me when someone recommended it. And like my interest was piqued right away. And it's a pretty interesting story. So essentially, our main character, Maali Almeida, he wakes up to find out that he's been recently killed. And he wakes up in what appears to be some sort of government office in the afterlife. And before he can move on to whatever comes next, he has 7 moons in which to lead the people that he loves and cares about. Lead them to a treasure trove of photography, because he's a war photographer and a closet homosexual. He has 7 moons in which to lead them to a treasure trove of photographs that he took that just document some incredible atrocities, and they have the power to reshape the politics of the country, essentially. So a pretty basic premise, but this book, it's all about the execution, and the execution of this story is brilliant. So this book is it's witty, it's hilarious, it's an indictment of history, it's scathing, and it's just by equal turns fun and equal turns sickening to read. It takes place roughly during the Sri Lankan Civil War, which is honestly a time period of conflict, and so I'm only vaguely familiar with, and only because I happen to be living in a building with like my apartment building is home to quite a few Sri Lankans. And you learn things from chatting with people here and there. That's the extent of my knowledge when it comes to this whole time period and that kind of thing. But yeah, it's a pretty dark conflict, like a civil war between the government and the Tamil Tigers, and it's responsible for thousands of deaths, and it's fueled by all the things that are typical of these type of countries with these type of motivations, like corruption, greed, racism, bigotry, you name it. It's all there. And Shehan incorporates all of these factors into the story in hilariously interesting ways that, like I said, they can be absurdist, they can be witty, but first and foremost, they're just scatting in the way that they condemn how all these things. Like it's incredibly well done. I have to refer to my notes for this book, because this is just such an amazing book. First and foremost, I think one of the telling things about this book, like one of the most interesting things about this book, is just the way that death is handled. The way that is approached and handled by the main characters in the story. Like when someone disappears, or deviates from their schedule or anything, you have to assume they're dead. They've been killed by the government, they've been killed by the military, or they've been killed by the rebels, and that's it, they're gone. Death is just a constant factor it's just a constant fear, or just a constant factor of life for everyone, to the point where they're pretty much inured to it. Like, there's only so long you can live under constant threat before it just ceases to impact you anymore, and that's kind of where the majority of the people that we see in this book they are on that particular spectrum. And when death is portrayed in this book, is not always easy. Like there's everyone you could think of, from abuse by the military, abuse by the police, hired killers, and they get into pretty extensive detail on how people are killed and how they're disposed of, that kind of thing. And oftentimes it's just for the most banal of things. Like it's crazy, and it's a testament to just how crazy this time period was. Because like just from some very very basic research online, it seemed like this is very much a sensation of the time, right? Shehan is a Sri Lankan author, and he does a brilliant, in terms of like just the way the characterization is handled in this book, and so he just does a brilliant job of evoking what I can really only describe as a Sri Lankan, the Sri Lankan personality, of projecting with these characters. Like when I read these people and some of their idiosyncrasies and some of their mannerisms and these kind of things, like I am very familiar with this behavior because of these mannerisms, because like I said, I've encountered quite a few Sri Lankan. Like my community, there's a fairly large Sri Lankan diaspora here, so he does like a good job of that. Like this is, even if you're not familiar with the time, the context and all of that, you can follow what's going on here. And obviously if you are, it's a bit more thing. All of that being said, like the book itself is the story itself is fairly chaotic. Like there's some, in true what I would think of in true like literary fashion, there's some very intriguing characters in here. Like there's a government officer who Maali remembers from his time alive, who kind of seems to want to do the best thing for him, but she's very much a bureaucrat at the same time. And this is in the afterlife, mind you. There's a guy who's kind of like a communist and an anarchist who keeps trying to convince Maali to stay in this kind of limbo before, instead of moving on, and to try and influence the real world from beyond the veil. So like it gets pretty interesting. Like there's the book itself, it's just, there's a huge cast of characters we encounter over the course of it as Maali goes through his he over the course of these 7 moons, and it's interesting to say the least. Like it's pretty crazy. It's wacky, it's absurd, it's just fascinating to read some of these people and where they are in society, and the way from these people you get such a good feel of how this society kind of is structured and how it operates and so. And it is coming from a developing country myself. Like many of the things that I see in this book I am intimately familiar with, like the archaic bureaucratic processes, the abuse of power by the police, the corruption, the way that money and power kind of give people the ability to essentially set themselves up as minor warlords and these kind of things. Like it's pretty nuts. It's pretty nuts is all I can say. What else can I say? Like, but one other thing that did strike me about the book, and I mentioned this early on, is like it's very scathing in its its condemnations, because Shehan he incorporates all these things, yes, but the way he incorporates them is like he pokes fun at them. He doesn't get up on a soapbox and preaches, but he's very very sarcastic in the way that he portrays these people. Like not just the let's call him antagonistic, for lack of a better word that I can think of at the moment. Not just within the country, but also like the international NGOs and the CIA, who were all very much present in and take part in this story. Like their approach to the conflict and their mannerisms and just the way that they decide to handle everything. Like there's a certain amount of bitterness that comes across in the page that you get it. Like on the outside looking in, supposedly these NGOs and these kind of things are supposed to be there to improve the quality of life, but you rarely see that on the ground. You rarely see that on the ground there or in any significant way. So like, it is funny. He doesn't spare anyone from getting smacked around when he's ready to bash who he has to bash in this book, and people get called out by name. Is all I'll say. Organizations get called out by name, I should say. But yeah, like this book, it's a book that's been growing more and more. Like I said, it's growing more and more in my mind since I've read it. It's just vibrant. It's amusing. There's some really depressing moments in it. There's also some touching moments in it, as Maali, like it really sets in what's happened to him, and he has to kind of like come to terms with it and what it means for the people in his life, and there's a certain amount of, you know, like regret because he of things left unsaid to people that he cares about and these kind of things. Like, it's all packed in here. It's a very poignant book, and it does punch very hard. Like, but for the most part, it's just an interest. Such a fascinating ride. Like, if you're a fan of books like Slaughterhouse 5 and Catch-22, this might be up your alley. It certainly has a lot in common with those books in terms of like just the wacky and the absurdist way that it approaches this kind of topic. But at the same time, there is like a human heart and depth to this book that you can't not appreciate after reading it. And like I said, you don't need to be super familiar with the time period. You don't need to be super familiar with the conflict. Everything is pretty much laid out for you. I'm only like vaguely familiar with any of this stuff, and I found it to be a pretty interesting ride. I can only imagine how this book must hit for people who are, you know, like actually who actually have like an emotional and personal investment in this. And I think that's pretty much all I have to say. Incredible book, one that's more and more becoming one of my favorites of the year. And yeah, if you've made it this far into the video, I highly recommend you check it out. Like I mentioned, it is very much a literary fantasy novel, so go into it, if you're primarily a genre reader like me, go into it expecting something slightly different, but something very enriching. Yeah, if you made it this far into the video, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.